Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Research America Alliance discussion. I'm Shilpa Rajan, and I'd like to thank you for joining on Zoom today and for your partnership in the Research America Alliance. If your organization is not a member, I hope you'll reach out to Kristen Furlong, Director of Membership and Development, whose email is in the chat, for information about the Alliance. Today, we are joined by Dr. Jason Owen-Smith, co-founder and executive director of the Institute for Research on Innovation and Science, IRIS, housed at the University of Michigan. We've asked Dr. Owen-Smith to discuss the unique consortium and insights from its efforts to capture, communicate, and enhance the public value of academic research in higher education. As always, please type your questions into the Q&A box or chat, and we'll get to them during the audience Q&A portion of today's session. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Owen-Smith. Over to you.
Thanks very much. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you to Research America and everyone behind the scenes for having me. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we'll move from here. Can everybody see what we need to?
Yes, looks great.
Excellent. Thank you. So I'm going to speak for about 20 minutes today on the theme of the value of creating and sustaining a platform to make really rich, usable, accessible data about academic research a public good. I'm going to talk about that in the context of the Institute for Research on Innovation and Science, which is an organization that I co-founded with Bruce Weinberg and Julia Lane about 10 years ago. And it was founded with a fairly clear vision. It emerged out of pressures to explain how academic research and scientific research generally contributed to the economy in the wake of the Reinvestment and Recovery Act after the Great Recession. And it was focused on the need for new types of data and evidence for universities, particularly individually and as a sector, to own and operate and control the source of data about their work and their impact, with a mandate to be transparent and research-based and rigorous in the work that it does, and with a real focus on trying to leverage data that's created in the course of the business of these organizations in order not to burden the people who are doing the work to bring us new information. The kind of data that IRIS takes is very specific. We draw information on the direct cost expenditures of sponsored projects, very fine-grained information, pulled from university HR sponsored projects and expenditures data in order to be able to really get a sense of not just what we spend on research, but what that spending lets us do. And in particular, the kind of data we bring in allows us, by virtue of seeing for all funders and all sponsored projects, these expenditures, the entire teams of people who work on research grants, undergraduate students through faculty. It also allows us to see every purchase of goods and services from vendors, which lets us see the network of businesses, nonprofits, and other organizations that support and engage with academic research across the country. We take these data and we integrate them with about 60 different data sources in order to produce a series of reports, dashboards, and a research data set in our capacity as an IRB-approved data repository, which allows researchers across the country to use these data for their own purposes and to help us develop our understanding of how the engine that is the U.S. academic research sector works and drives the kinds of outcomes we want to see for our society. The sorts of things these data allow us to do are pretty broad. One of the most important is a move to allow us to really think about multiple types of impact. There's the kind of impact that we often see and often talk about, which is the technologies, the ideas, the new knowledge that's developed out of research. But we forget quite often that research is also training, and that the people who learn to do work at the frontiers of pretty much every field of human endeavor with research support from the federal government, from nonprofits, from industry, and others, right, are also a key product, a key result of the research mission. And the kinds of data we pull together allow us to realize this sort of image that's in Nobel laureate Paul Romer's recent quote about the importance of producing both papers and people, and thinking about people as a key vector for carrying knowledge and carrying skills out into the economy. I think, and you'll see in a second, that one of the core features of IRIS and the approach we use is to really dig into the idea that a huge part of what we do in research is train the people who go on and take the skills and knowledge they use and apply it all over the economy. What you see on the screen is an example of a snapshot of one of the reports we produce, both for individual universities and in the aggregate, that tells you once people are trained on research and leave the institution where they go and get jobs. And the answer is often surprising. On the one hand, it's in the core of the knowledge economy. And on the other hand, it spreads across the entire country and across pretty much every sector. And what you can see with these data and the story you can start to tell is one not just about the long-term effects of a new technology that creates a new industry or a new way of doing business, but of the day-to-day process by which research trains the people who become the engines of discovery and innovation in the corporate sector, in government, in nonprofits. We also tell stories about short-term impact. One of the things we've found over the years is that it's often the case that people who don't know how the sector works and don't think about it in these terms imagine that when a grant is funded at an institution like mine to a principal investigator like myself, it sort of disappears into a black hole on campus, and it goes to support only people like me. But what research grants allow institutions and investigators to do is hire the people, we saw that earlier, and buy the stuff, everything from pipettes to supercomputers, that's necessary to get research work done. And we can trace the immediate economic impact of those purchases out into the economy to see that federal grants actually hit the university and then flow out almost immediately to every congressional district and pretty much to every industry. These kinds of reports are used together by our constituents, our members, some of the associations and others we work with to help explain, both in the very near term, why it behooves everyone to continue investing in these processes, and in the longer term, how those investments generate at multiple timescales all kinds of positive benefits. So why is that important? Well, in the future of federal research investment feels a little uncertain right now. This is a pretty canonical picture that is the percent of GDP that's invested in research from different sources. And what you see here is a pretty steep and secular decline in academic research investment. And we've seen a lot of recent budget cuts that raise even further questions and create even more uncertainty. But fewer dollars coming in doesn't mean less scrutiny or lower expectations. This is from an article that we produced a little while ago about the CHIPS and Science Act. It appeared in the conversation. If President Biden gets everything he asked for in his fiscal 25 budget for science, which seems unlikely, right? The CHIPS and Science Act, which is one of the marquee investments of his administration, will be about $15.2 billion behind the authorized funding levels that it had for NSF, for instance. But that gap doesn't mean that the expectations for impact or the measurement and reporting mandates or the research security and compliance requirements that are right now hitting our campuses and increasing costs and causing additional work will go away. What it does mean, however, is that we're likely to see changes in science. And this is some of the research that's done with IRIS data. A recent paper suggests that when federal funding declines, researchers like myself go out and they find other ways to get their work done. But those other ways often come with more focused mandates oriented toward current technology and reduce more blue sky patenting, more blue sky publishing and entrepreneurial activities. There's also some evidence from another new paper that uses IRIS data that when federal funding is interrupted, it actually harms the scientific workforce in fairly dramatic ways by pushing talented people, particularly young people, out of research and often out of the country. And this is bad for a variety of reasons because it looks like we're going to keep getting these interruptions. It looks like we're going to keep getting the continuing resolutions. And so we need to be able to make a case for why those interruptions, even if short, are challenging. And research like this helps. It's also the case that there's not a ton of trust. As a sector, higher education is facing some challenges. This is a snapshot of a couple of recent Gallup polls, one from 2015, one from 2023. And what it shows us is that across pretty much every demographic group, approval of higher education has declined, sometimes dramatically in the last years. And that decline's matched with an increasing set of concerns about the scholarship itself, about the research we do, about the work we produce. What this means is that when faced with challenges that may not have to do with research, credibility problems spill over and can affect our work, and with it, the larger society and economy. What that means, too, is that we need to figure out, and one of the things that I believe IRIS does very well, is figure out how to speak clearly about the value of the research mission and its outcomes in ways that address the concerns of today. So what you see here is just a snapshot of what the CHIPS and Science Act empowered the Technology and Innovation Partnerships Directorate of the National Science Foundation to do. Right? The idea here is that research becomes very explicitly an engine for regional economic development and opportunity generation and the creation of new jobs through technology, through discovery. The challenge is that if we have high expectations for this and money is low and credibility and trust are a little on the low side, it sets up potentially a very dangerous situation for universities. And so we need to tell a different kind of story. We need to tell a story that's rich in data, but that also is rigorous, that can be explained and shown, that's founded on good knowledge, right? And that is amenable to the kinds of storytelling that make it real to our various constituencies. That story is hard to tell, but there's an example that we've been working on that I think can give a little flavor. It goes back to CHIPS and Science and to the idea that that act created not just potentially an as yet unrealized bolus of funds, but also a new component of a mission for the National Science Foundation that was focused on science investments in a set of critical and emerging industries aimed very explicitly at place-based economic development. The challenge of that for measurement for people like me is that The things you see on your left, the technology areas, aren't disciplines or fields in the sense that you can find them in established codes in most standard data sets. They also aren't industries as they're traditionally conceptualized. So if you think about artificial intelligence, it's simultaneously everywhere and because of that, kind of nowhere right now. And so we need a way to think about how we measure both the inputs into these highly important fields and the outputs of them so that we can see their effects at the levels where the effects are supposed to be pitched. That's not something that most of our current measurement systems are capable of doing, but it is something that we're spending a good bit of time on now, working with partners in states across the country and with universities across the country, and with support from TIP itself to develop out a prototype system to do this kind of measurement. And that system, in keeping with IRIS's mission and mandate and data structures, is highly people-centric. In other words, what it does is focus first on identifying the sets of individuals who are working in a critical technology area, say artificial intelligence. Right? Instead of trying to define what AI is as a set of topics, we define the field in terms of the people who make it go. And we read the topics, the areas, the capabilities, the technologies, the discoveries at any given moment out of the work of that set of people. Because of the way the data are structured, we can see when someone publishes work in that field through the IRIS data, every person who works on the grants that support them, we can actually get a sense of the individuals as vectors for carrying new AI or other technologies out into the workforce. And then through partnerships with states, and particularly with state labor market information shops, we can link these data to unemployment insurance information to see where those people are getting hired. They become a kind of tracer condition to help us identify the industries and employers where this new technology is being applied. In other words, what we're doing is adopting what the AI 100-Year Study Committee sort of half jokingly said was a definition of artificial intelligence a few years ago. AI is pretty much what AI researchers do, which means that the industry of AI is pretty much the set of people that hire AI researchers to do what they do. In thinking about that and in looking at the kinds of data, the full team data that IRIS collects, what we learn relatively quickly is very much the lesson that people are a primary vector, a primary outcome of research. What we see is that there's a set of AI authors, people who publish in this field. And for every one of them, we find about 22 other people, students, postdocs, professional and technical staff, other faculty, research technicians, who work on the grants. These people are the usually unseen part of the iceberg of scientists, of scientific work, but their movements and the jobs they later get and the work they later do are key to understanding the kinds of impacts we want to be able to talk about. And we can actually put numbers on them. So for a set of IRIS participating universities, there were about 12,500 authors of AI papers and about 275,000 other people who were employed in some capacity on the grants that supported those authors. And those people, right, are more gender balanced, are younger, are skewed more towards students and trainees, and are exactly the kinds of people who are moving out into the economy. And when we follow them in preliminary data using authorship as a marker out into the economy, it allows us to see which parts of different industries, which areas of the economy are most quickly adopting and using AI technologies. This is a little toy example of two manufacturing industries, both of which make chips. One of them, corn chips. the other semiconductor chips. Perhaps not surprisingly, we see a lot more mobility of people trained on AI grants into semiconductor manufacturing than we do into corn chip manufacturing. And we can roll those numbers up to produce initial estimates of how broadly the new technology is affecting work and employers in different sectors of the economy. This is a new way to think about both measurement and about tracing impact, and we can yoke it to a bunch of really interesting stories about how this goes on. Even more importantly, we can position those findings and those people and those employers in geographies that get down to a level of granularity and timeliness that can actually be used for the sorts of reporting that we need to produce in order to speak to the mandates of the CHIPS Act, but also to convey to constituencies in our state, in the federal government, and across a variety of different groups what it is in the near term, as well as in the long term, that research allows academics to do. The idea here is that by putting together a consortium, right, that brings in data, that cleans and integrates it, makes it available for research, that uses it in responsible ways governed by the needs of the institutions, and that works with partners across a variety of sectors, government, industry, nonprofit, other academics, to build and sustain prototypes like this and systems that allow for new styles and types of measurement. What we're able to do and to begin to do is really put a new type of flesh on the bones for a deeply responsive and regional, technology-driven, but people-centric and place-based picture of the full sweep of the ways that academic research can and does contribute to the economy and more broadly to the health, wealth, and well-being of the people in it. Thanks.
Fantastic presentation, Dr. Owen-Smith. Thank you so much. I'd like to ask a few questions that came to mind as you spoke. First off, how did you first get involved in studying universities? And what makes a research university a good subject for a sociology study? And what are the challenges to conducting this work?
There are a lot. It's a fun question. I'm thinking about it a little bit because if you told me 20 years ago as a young sociologist that this is what I'd be doing today, I probably couldn't even have conceptualized it. I started thinking about universities about at that time in graduate school because I was really fascinated by the question of how to think about science as a type of work, as something that people metaphorically or actually picked up their lunch pails and went and did every day. And that led me through a variety of projects to working heavily on the biotechnology industry, which at the time was very much driven by academic innovations and the movement of individuals out of academia. So it was sort of a natural progression for me to begin to start thinking about universities as hubs where lots and lots of different types of activities could feed important work around the economy and to try to figure out ways to understand and to make that story clear. And along the way, I developed a taste for large-scale data analysis and for a very broad gauge view of collaboration. And so the range of types of disciplines and people and data and organizations that one needs to work with in order to really understand the sort of magnificent engine that is our system of academic institutions is just endlessly fascinating and an immense amount of fun. But it also poses challenges because you have to be able to think in a lot of different registers and understand that the thing that is so native and such a home to someone like me is really a very different animal when viewed from different perspectives. And so trying to figure out how to take what we do inside the academy and use it to meet our various constituents where they are and explain why, we should receive the kinds of support we do from the public is really a motivating force for me.
Thank you. That actually flows nicely into my next question. Want to know a little bit more about your work at IRIS. Are there ways that we can improve the outcomes for scientific research investments?
I think so. There are a number, and I would be far from the only one who has talked about them. So I'll stay away from many of the things that I know your organization and many others do talk about, which is things like reporting requirements and compliance mandates and indirect costs and the very nitty-gritty that's really essential to this. And instead think about if we envision academic research not as something separate from the educational mission of the university, but as an integral part of it. And if we envision, as I've tried to sketch for you today, people and the skills they develop as one of, if not the sort of key short to medium term outcome of that research, the question becomes, what could we do to make it a more effective thing that more students, more graduate students, more postdocs could more effectively take part in, benefit from, learn from, understand, and carry out into the world? And there are a variety of things. One of the most surprising early findings from IRIS data was the sheer number of undergraduate students at most campuses who at some point in their careers on campus are paid usually as temporary research assistants, but still paid employees on research grants, particularly federal research grants. We know from good research in the education domain that that kind of high impact experience and connection can often help people move forward in STEM careers. It can help to broaden participation. It can also have effects on later career outcomes. We could think in systematic ways about how we might improve that process by doing things that are very simple, like making it easy for students to use work-study funds to support this kind of research work, right? Even if the argument is, are students on our campus better off, earning their work-study washing glassware in an active scientific laboratory than washing dishes in, a food service group? I believe the answer to that is yes. There's some research that suggests it is. There are a number of such tweaks that can really help, I think, to better integrate both the story and the outcomes that we want to see.
So you're definitely collecting a lot of great data. How do you ensure that this data, the insights gathered by IRIS, are accessible to a broad range of stakeholders, policymakers, educators, and advocacy groups?
We're still working on that. It's partially, a question I'd toss back to members of your audience about how we can make it more accessible. There are two or three major challenges and possibilities. So first, it's important to say that the data we work with are restricted in the sense that they represent information that isn't publicly available. We take them from universities under memoranda of understanding that carry with them confidentiality and privacy protections, which we take very, very seriously, and mean that, for instance, researchers who access the data can't just go download them. They work through a virtual data enclave that we maintain, and we do privacy disclosure review on everything that comes out the door. So there's a set of questions about how you balance open access and responsible use of data like this that I think are essential to any such endeavor. There are also questions about how you make what is very large scale. Our current data set has information on record level spending for about $192 billion worth of grants across about 100 campuses on around the country. Um, Data at that scale is hard to parse and hard to make sense of. And so we spend a lot of time figuring out how to present it in interactive fashions and in very targeted static fashions that speak to particular audiences and use cases. Our primary groups right now have traditionally been using the kinds of data that we work with for government relations and communications purposes. Internally, universities use them for research development and also for faculty development. We're increasingly seeing them be tied to concerns with graduate student and postdoctoral outcomes, and with efforts to rethink what the doctoral degree might look like as we move deeper into the new century. I'm dating myself. Another thing that we do is try as much as possible, realizing that our mandate is not advocacy, to make the data live by both making it possible to find and tell concrete stories and by surfacing those and telling them where we can in op-eds, white papers, commissioned papers, things of that nature. The last thing we do is we partner a lot. And so everything that I've shown you today, everything that we produce, in one way or another, grows out of work with some set of stakeholders. We're sort of deeply committed to a sort of light version of a user-centered design process here. And so part of what we do is find pockets of partners who want to answer particular types of questions and then work with them to figure out what a provisional answer is and take the results out to their constituents and communities to see what's worth scaling, what is actually of value. We do a lot of experimentation in this space.
Makes sense. It's quite a bit of work. And then I have one more question, and you touched upon this a little bit, but we care about this issue a lot at Research America. Um, you've written a lot about the scientific workforce, and what are some ways we can support the next generation of scientists?
So there are a variety of ways. I think one of the most important is a theme that I've hammered in two ways here, maybe too much, so I apologize if I'm repeating myself. But one is we need to stop thinking about research as separate from teaching. We need to start thinking about research as a component of an educational mission that for a lot of students may be a small but very important component. For particularly students that are going to go into at a bachelor's or master's or especially doctoral level research or technology fields, the kind of hands-on work and the facility with collaboration and the ability to really occupy a problem that doesn't have a ready answer, right? Where there isn't an answer key, is a key skill that it's hard to find in other places on many college campuses. And I think we should lean into that. I think we should also lean into ways to making the many different valuable trajectories that people take out of the institution and out of their training, both visible and valued. I didn't say it as loudly as I might have in some of the presentation because I was trying to stay to time, but the entire architecture of what I've just shown you is predicated on the idea that it's of immense value to our economy and to our society to have a diverse, talented, highly trained scientific and technical workforce that doesn't just stay in the academy. In fact, that's a win, right? That's a huge way to think about what impact is, how you actually see follow-on innovations, where the work really gets done. And one of the ways in which, discoveries made in labs or research groups on campus get carried out most immediately into the world. And so I think thinking not about alternative to academic careers, but just about careers and the ways in which research experience can both prepare and amplify the ability of people to do the kind of work in the kind of places they want to do and in doing so, generate greater benefits is really a different frame on thinking about the workforce. It also raises all kinds of new ways to think about things like how do we actually match the the skills people are carrying out of their education and training with not what was needed last year or 6 months ago, but a little bit with based on the innovation and research work where the skill needs and developments are going to be going with things like AI. So if we stay close to research in some sense, part of what we get is a somewhat prospective view of the trends that we're going to be following. And, having people who are right at the edge of that work in very real ways, connected to the university, moving out of it, and doing the work offers all kinds of interesting routes for that development.
Thank you. It's important work. Now, we've had a excellent conversation, and I'd like to now ask my colleague Jacqueline to join me with questions from the audience.
Thank you, Shilpa, and thank you, Jason. This has been an excellent conversation so far. So starting with our first question from the audience, you touched on data accessibility earlier. Do you think, would anyone oppose making this data public?
There are good reasons why it is not public. They range from legal. In some instances, many institutions interpret some of the data about students, particularly student employees that we take, as being covered by FERPA. And so there are legal protections that we handle through MOU arrangements under a variety of exceptions that we work with universities on, most notably the study exception. There are also privacy concerns. One of the things that is, I think, most valuable about the aggregation of data like this is that it allows us to do research on and to really understand what's happening to particularly groups of people who are underrepresented, for whom they're relatively small numbers of individuals. And if you went to look to see, how their programs were preparing them to move on to different types of jobs at one campus or even two campuses, it would be very, very easy to re-identify them, and we'd run into privacy problems. And so I, in general, favor the most open access to data possible. And there are pieces of the data that after privacy disclosure, we make very publicly available. You can see some of them on our website. There are also improvements to public data that we make broadly available. But I think there are good reasons, for reasons of trust, for reasons of risk, and for reasons of not placing the burden of, privacy or confidentiality concerns on people who may be less well equipped to bear it in order to better understand and help. That we don't necessarily want data like these to be completely accessible. So there's always a fine balance. And what we've tried to do is fall down on the side of the broadest responsible accessibility for research purposes we can, and on always deferring to individual institutions who participate about the uses of their data. What we can and do make public is aggregate data that represents more than, I believe our current standard is 3 or 5 campuses, and that can't easily be used either in a primary or a secondary fashion to re-identify an individual. So the reason we don't make it purely public is for those kinds of data responsibility, data stewardship, privacy, legal issues.
Great, thank you. Thanks for that overview. For our next question, how can your organization, IRIS, help researchers from poor countries in Africa with grants and full scholarship and employment opportunities?
It's a really important and somewhat challenging question. So one of the things that we can do through a variety of data linkages, again, often to restricted data, is use this work to demonstrate just how important and how valuable and essential the work of folks who come here for education and training and either stay or don't for their careers that come next are to the process of science and research and its productivity and its impact. Thinking here particularly of work that is done with data we link to Census Bureau information that's available through the Federal Statistical Research Data Center system, another restricted data enclave. The work we do, as I said earlier, is not primarily advocacy work. So we're not in a position where we can easily go out and create pathways for people. What we can do is ensure that in the sense of having an equitable data system, we're both representing those people well and producing findings that don't leave them out of the equation, that do justice to the roles and the work that they do. And by doing that, to make them a real and true part of the kind of story that I've been telling with. So our role in that kind of work is not to make an opportunity happen for a person. That's not what we're equipped to do. It's to help to set the groundwork and explain why those opportunities should be systematic parts of our system, and to engage in the conversations and the research and the presentation of information that supports that.
Great, thank you. And I think we only have time for one more, then I'll turn it back to Shilpa. So Jason, do you or Iris, do you have experience targeting communication to legislators? And how do you reach them? And what tends to resonate most with legislators?
It depends on honestly which legislators, to tell you the truth, both in terms of individual personalities, interests, focal areas, but also in terms of the mandates. We do a lot of work in partnership with the government relations officers and staff at member institutions and through work with associations of institutions in various ways to produce data. I've done a decent amount of work just myself in communicating. One of the things that we find is incredibly valuable is not direct outreach to the members themselves, but often providing the sort of first cut information that can be used to educate a new staffer about, in your district or in your state, what are the universities? What are they doing? What is the research? How does research work? How does this appear in your district, even if you don't have an institution that does a lot of research sitting in your district? I think here of another one of the early IRIS findings that we talked about, which is figuring out how to make the locality of these institutions and their deep association with particular places. Like you can't imagine the University of Michigan deciding to move to Alabama. It's just not going to happen, right? Just like you can't imagine the University of Alabama moving to Michigan, right? The locality of these places means they tend to get associated with particular people, but the kinds of webs of movement, of resources, of goods and services, of people, of ideas, make them a truly national and international resource. And you can see that in very concrete ways. So for instance, a senator from a state that may not have a massive research university might, in some cases, have a big employer that supplies lots of universities, right? And being able to say, this is how your state benefits from funds that flow to support research here directly and immediately can often be important. Thinking about, particular technology areas, or the ways in which, the system of universities helps to keep us as a society better able to be responsive to problems we might not even know we have yet, because of the way it's structured and the kind of research it does, are all really important parts of the story. And figuring out how to tell those stories locally in terms that are about the district, the economy, the citizens, and not about the papers we've published or the money we've spent, but what that spending lets us do and what it enables the people who do the work that it makes possible to do once they're done with that work and going on to other things.
Right, right. That sounds a lot of what we at Research America do with our advocacy work, district-specific messaging. So let me turn it back to Shilpa. Thank you to the audience for your questions. Shilpa?
Thank you, Jacqueline. Looks like that's all we have time for today. Thank you to the audience for your thoughts and participation. Before you go, join us for our next Alliance discussion with Dr. Johnny Rudder, Director of the National Center for Advancing Transatlantic Sciences, NCATS, at the National Institutes of Health on October 15th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Dr. Rudder will share NCATS's latest priorities, exciting advances in the field, and her vision for the future. Thank you again for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Have a great rest of your week.